let's all get started, because I don't want to cut off any time at all from our guests today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tomas Garza. I'm the director of the Texas Language Center and an associate professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. And we were, Paula and I, talking about kind of our back history and so forth. I think we're now finally entering into, for this series, Language Matters, we've now been running for, I believe this is our 15th year of running Language Matters. So yeah, good news all around in that respect. And hopefully we'll just keep going for as long as we have support from the structures that are bigger than ourselves here. I do hope as you came in, please come on in, that you pick up, obviously have some lunch, help yourself to some lunch and something to drink, and you picked up our listing. This is also material that's online where you'll get more updated information, but it'll give you some upcoming Texas Language Center events and news that is happening now. We'd love to see you at more TLC events. So excited about today's talk, and this is a kind of capstone talk following up on our wonderful Professor Oksana Lutsishina's talk on presenting her work and about and on Ivan and Phoebe, which was published by the person who's going to be speaking to us today, as it turns out, in translation, of course. Where do I begin? I'll begin with a couple of notes that I pulled off of the infamous Wikipedia. Where else? So Will Evans, our speaker today, grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, and attended Emory University, where he received his BA in History and Russian Language and Culture in 2005. Shortly after, around 2009, the first year at the Texas Language Center became a thing. We met, and a conversation occurred that may have kept him here in our own Slavic department getting his master's degree. But instead, Will received his master's in arts and Russian culture from Duke University, a second-tier institution. But then went on, and then of course the rest is history. In 2013, moved back to Dallas and founded Deep Vellum Publishing. In 2015, he opened Deep Vellum Books, a bookstore on Commerce Street. And I didn't know this actually until collecting this. Deep Vellum, I got the pun with vellum and the idea of printing, but then the neighborhood in which the store is located is actually Deep Ellum, which is very, very cool. In 2019, Deep Vellum Publishing bought two small publishing houses, Los Angeles' Phoneme Media and Austin's A Strange Object. In 2020, he acquired Dalkey Publishing, Dalkey Archive Press, the publisher of, among other authors, Nobel Prize winner John Fosse. Our very close connection here, as I mentioned, is the publication of Ivan and Phoebe, just, I want to say 2 years ago, I believe, maybe the last year?
Yeah, last year.
Yeah, last year.
Before.
Award-winning.
Yep.
So it also within my area, I should say, of Slavic languages and literature, is always wonderful to see that. We're so excited to have him. I'm going to stop babbling. I could keep going, talking more about the publishing house itself, but I'm sure that's going to be part of the talk. The business of literature from Texas to the world to Texas. Please help me, join me in welcoming Will Evans back to Austin.
Woo! Can I pace? Is that going to be okay if I walk around? For everyone watching at home, which is a joy. I appreciate the introduction, Dr. Garza, because you're such a character in the Deep Vellum story, right? He neglected the funniest part of the story. So if you kind of go back in time, if you rewind all the way back, the business of literature begins with a moment that we all have when we read the book that changes our life, right? Not your favorite book, but the one that changes everything for you. And ideally, we all have at least one, because we're all obviously here, opting in to a lunchtime to talk about the business of literature. When I was 14 years old, I accidentally read a novel called The Life of a Useless Man by Maxim Gorky, and I had no idea what I was getting into. This was foreign literature year at my high school, which meant every single other book we read that entire semester was by a British author. And for the final book report, you had to read one that was not written in English. And so the teacher gave us a list of all the books in our high school library that were translated from other languages. And of course, it had names that you would know, like War and Peace and Les Mis. And I said, I would never write a book report on a book that anyone else would deign to read. If you want to know a little bit about me, that tells you a lot right there. I'm looking for what is not being done and what is not being talked about to try to elevate it. And so I picked a book I thought that had the coolest title. And of course, The Life of a Useless Man is now haunting me the rest of my life as I go through the days. But when I read that book, I got really interested all of a sudden for the first time in Russian culture, Russian history in particular. And I said, one day when I'm lucky enough to go to college, if they offer Russian, I will take Russian there. And so I went through high school. I stayed a reader. I tried to dabble in writing, as we all do as young romantic teenagers. But then when I got to college, they did offer Russian at Emory in my undergrad first semester. So I took Russian 101. And they were also offering a course called 19th Century Russian Literature and Translation. And that's the course that changed my life. There was a professor, Dr. Elena Glazov-Korygin, who was very passionate, and she shared her passion with the world. And I went from being a poli-sci and history major to a history, or essentially a Russian literature major. And I was obsessed. And the problem is that when I was in high school, if you ever want to know how I got to Austin, I was in a band all through high school as well with some guys, and I quit to go to college, and they got a singer with talent and got signed and started touring. They're called He Is Legend. I recommend everybody here listen to them. They're wonderful. And they, while I was in college, started doing really well and touring around. They were always like, come on tour with us. And I was like, I'm in college. I have to finish my degree. And when I was coming out of the program, I had been accepted to a PhD program for Russian literature with the application that essentially read like, I don't know, Dostoevsky? Like, what else do you do when you love to read Russian books? You go get a PhD in it, right? No lie, that was pretty much the application. But someone accepted me, and I was like going to go. And my friends were like, no, seriously, come on tour now. You said you had to finish school. You finished it. And I was like,
time to tour.
Time to tour, right? That PhD program's not going anywhere. Maybe I should think about a better way of looking at life than, I don't know, Dostoevsky, right? And so I ended up touring with them for 2 years, and then I moved to Los Angeles. And when I was in Los Angeles, I started dating a woman who was from the great state of Texas. And we were dating for about a year, and then we decided to move to Texas together. And so at the beginning of 2009, I moved to Austin, and I became the guy in charge of booking all the shows at a venue downtown called Emo's. That is no longer downtown. It's now across the river. So this is 2009, when one could say, this is the end of the Austin that was before, and the beginning of the Austin that is now, which was great too. And one thing that was really interesting was for the 4 years I had been out of undergraduate working in the music business, I had pretty much stopped reading, like almost completely. I was at concerts 7 nights a week, really odd hours. I had an office job all day and then at concerts all night. So it was hard to find the time to read, and I fell out of the rhythm of reading, which is something that's very important in life, because we've all kind of, again, we've opted into this life of literature, right? But the vast majority of society has opted out. Right? And so something that has been very apparent to me in those 4 years remind me all the time is that it's very easy to fall out of the habit for any reason with reading and with feeling like you're a part of this culture at all. And I wanted to address that. And so when I got to Austin, I visited a little bookstore down at 6th and Lamar called Book People, which yesterday celebrated its 54th birthday. Holy moly, right? Wow. In terms of crazy things that exist, the fact that Book People turned 54, in this changing times is just extraordinary. But one day I went into Book People, and I went up to some shelf, and it had staff recommendations, the bookseller picks. And there were 5 books there, and I bought all 5. And I was like, I'm going to get back into reading. Let's go. And I read the first 4, and I hated all of them. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this. And the 5th one, I read it, and it blew my mind wide open, like I was back discovering Russian literature for the first time. It was a book that was strange, a book that was all over the place, a book that was doing something different and yet was powerful and profound. At the same time, it was funny. At the same time, it was deep. And it was a book called The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolaño, right, which had just come out, right? And I realized, I had this awakening moment that maybe the problem wasn't with the books, but with me and the way I was seeking them out, right? I was looking for kind of what was only the popular stuff, when in reality, I was looking for something that was different. And as we all know, Roberto Bolaño is a very popular author. He's what we would consider now, in our parlance at Deep Vellum, a gateway author, right? You were one person before you read him, and you're another after, right? There are gateway authors like this for all of us, right? And at any stage in our lives and in our reading journeys, it's important to find those authors so that at any stage, you can be invited in to the life of literature. Again, this is so important to us and kind of gets to the mission of Deep Vellum. And what's kind of crazy is that in the timeline of my life, it seems like it goes in fast forward. From the moment I read The Savage Detectives, I was like, well, I obviously can't go buying 5 books a day, like, for the rest of time. I need to go get a library card. And so I went to the old Austin Public Library location, not the beautiful brand new one y'all have now, and I got a library card. And as I was going to check out, I had some books. I don't even remember what I was checking out. But on the way out, I'll never forget the book that was there on a display of stuff that had just arrived at the library. It was a book called Vilnius Poker, right, by a guy named Ricardas Gavelis. And I don't speak Lithuanian, so I know I'm not pronouncing it correctly. But I said, oh, Vilnius, a former Soviet territory, republic, let's go. So I checked out the book, and I knew nothing about it. And it was a paper overboard hardcover, and it was published by a publisher I had never heard of called Open Letter Books. And Open Letter Books had just been started publishing that year. And there was a publishing house at the University of Rochester dedicated to literature and translation. And I read that book, and it also blew my mind into a million pieces. And I was like, I am on to something. And at the checkout desk, what was also fascinating was it had a sign there and it said, if you get an Austin Public Library card, did you know you can also get a text share card and check out books from any university library in the state? And I was like, oh, are you kidding me? And I got that card, and I rode my bike straight here to UT, and I went to the library, and I went to the PG 3000 section, which we all know well. Us Russian literature nerds know this is Slavic languages and literatures right here. I used to work in the library, if you couldn't tell, in school. And so I went in, and I fell on my knees before my old friends and said, I'm back. Let's go. And while I was doing that, I checked out a few books, and I said, you know, where's the Russian literature department on campus? I bet there's one. It's got to be. I know it's a good one. I remember reading about it back in the day. And I said, oh, here it is. I found it. And I was walking down the halls, and there was a door open in the hallway. Do you remember this? And there was a door cracked, and school was not in. There were no classes happening. It was like an empty hallway. I think it was in the summer. And there was a poster on the wall of a guy named Vladimir Vysotsky as Hamlet, one of the most famous images of all 20th century Russian culture for those of us who kind of are into this. And I poked my head in, and I was like, cool poster. And Dr. Garza goes, who are you? Sit down right here. And we sat down and we became friends. And he said, maybe you should start auditing some Russian language classes here. Get back into the groove of it. And so all this happened in fast forward in life, right? And all this is what precipitates Deep Vellum, right? Which has a, there we go, the deep vellumness, the business of literature, the Texasness of it all, whatever we're all doing here. It begins here, right? Thanks for kickstarting the journey. So it's an honor to be here. And that was a long-winded introduction to say, you never know in life where the forked paths are going to take you, right? Life is literally a Borges story. Let's have some fun with it and get weird, right? And that's where the business of literature begins. Because from there, I did want to go to this program. Unfortunately, I was marrying a Texan. You know how Texans are? They're kind of strong-willed women. And she was like, I'm going to go to law school, and it's hard to get into UT Law, as you may know. So let's apply to backup schools. And our backup schools were in my home state of North Carolina. And so against my will, but fortuitously in other ways, we ended up in North Carolina. So I did go to Duke. She went to UNC for law school. And I do love it there. And for those who have not visited North Carolina, you'll see why. It's a beautiful state, Dr. Garza. It's a wonderful place to be. And what was kind of fascinating is when I applied to graduate school, my application this time, which I think is really interesting for this room, was quite different. I had been out of school for 5 years. I've been in the real world, right? And we all know that this is as much part of the real world as we are willing to make it. But I had been out there and seeing that the lessons of the humanities that really impacted me so much, the big questions of Russian literature that got me obsessed with this in the first place, seemed to be lacking out there in the world. And so my application to grad school was like, how can we take the lessons of the humanities, the big questions of literature, and change society for the better, right? How can we do that? And the school that had accepted me to the PhD program 5 years before rejected me with a letter that said, we don't have a single class you can take. You should probably go to Duke, which was really funny. And so I went there and began to ask that question in every single class that I took. And at the same time, I was asking Professor how to get into how I might be able to read more Russian literature. There's a book that had just come out in Russian that I wanted to read, and she encouraged me to get into it by translating it myself. And I don't know if any of y'all are translators. I know 1, maybe more, 2, 3, 4, 5. Awesome. We all have that moment, too, when someone encourages us to get into translation. And Dr. Carol Apollonio said this is the best way to learn a language, is to live inside of it, to see how it works, to learn how to express it, and to go from there. And so with her encouragement, I got into translation. And in the act of translating and trying to find a publishing house for who might put this work out, I chanced upon a very small but active corner of the literary world that is interested in literature and translation into English. And it turns out that publisher of Vilnius Poker, the book I read when I lived here in Austin, has a blog called 3%, talking about roughly how few books come out in English every year from other languages. This publisher, Chad Post, is very passionate, talking about the publishing industry, which is, I can't begin to tell you how rare it is. Does anyone here know how many books are published in America every year? You're really smart people. Why don't you know? Okay, what was the highest grossing book last year in America? What author won the Nobel Prize 3 weeks ago? 4 weeks ago? The Korean author. What was her name? Hong Kong. There we go. Who won it 2 years ago? Huh? Glick didn't win it in 23, did she? She did, 23? Yeah. Yep. Okay. This is good. We're all so good. So you guys have a better idea of that, but you don't know how many books are published in the country? Y'all are smart people. Now, here's the thing. It was a trick question because no one really knows, and it's a secret. Why is it a secret? All right? So what is the publishing industry, right? All right? Has anyone ever heard the term the Big Five?
Yes,
right?
Yes,
They're the 5 publishers. They're all headquartered in what city? New York City, right? And they control roughly 80 to 90% of the books that are published in America every year. Now, instantly my spidey senses go up that doesn't seem to be right, right? There's something wrong with that. And if less than 3% of all the books that are published in America every year are translated from other languages, then it seems that who is really responsible for that? Those 5 companies, right? And then you break down the data into what they're doing even more, and you start to realize that the business model of these corporate publishers, the Big Five as we call them, seems to be a blockbuster model that approaches what we see in cinema today, right? We know that there are 5 movie studios that are putting out the same stuff over and over and over again. And if you go to the theaters these days, even the great Alamo Drafthouse, you'll notice that most of the movies are from 1, 2, or 3 studios, right? And the content is roughly the same over and over and over again. And it makes a lot of money for some people, but it has done something really bad to the way that we enjoy cinema. Same thing has happened in literature, right? We turn on the news now around the world, conflicts happening, right? Russia invades Ukraine 2 years ago, right? Something foundational about the Deep Vellum question is built into that. And what do we do about this, right? When I started Deep Vellum, I came up with this idea in grad school because the publisher of Open Letter, who had published this Lithuanian book, had a blog and said, if you care about how few books are coming out every year in translation, start your own publishing house and do something about it. And again, in my memory, which is fuzzy, and you try to make timelines seem linear, and they never are, my wife turns to me that night and says, I got a job offer in Dallas. You want to move there? It'd be near my family. She grew up in Weatherford. You might know it's west of Fort Worth. And she's like, we'd be near family. We could settle down. We could have kids in Dallas. And I was like, what am I going to do with a Russian degree in Dallas, right? And it was like, wait, but this guy said start your own publishing house. Yeah, what if I did? And so I Googled, and I was like, what about publishers in Dallas? And there were no literary publishers in Dallas. In fact, SMU had just shut down its press. So, okay, what if I go work at a bookstore for a little while, make some friends? Googled last bookstore selling new books that's independent, right? Like independent bookstore. Last one in all of DFW, 8 million people in DFW, had just shut down. So there were no independent bookstores. And you're like, wow. So there's 2 ways to look at that, right? One is to say scorched earth, better turn and go somewhere else. Or to look at it and say, fertile ground, ready for a renaissance. Let's go have some fun. And I started saying, what if we started to use literature as a way to build bridges to people and between the world? What if you could do translations in Dallas? And I found out that the University of Texas at Dallas started one of the first literary translation studies programs in the country. Wow, that's an amazing thing. What if we teamed up with them, other resources in the city, and put literature on a map in a way to say that writers from Dallas and writers from Moscow and everywhere in between could do literature and be in conversation with each other. And that doesn't seem like such a radical idea to this room, but boy, let me tell you, within the publishing industry, why doesn't anyone else do it? Right? Why weren't they doing it, and why aren't they doing it now, is the million-dollar question. And so as we started to put together the business plan for Deep Vellum, I started to say, this is something I do want to do in Dallas. The first question I had is, obviously I don't want to publish just Russian books. The world is bigger than that. And I took a look around at what publishers were doing things in translation and said, what is still missing? What is missing in literature? And how can we build a business model that supports literature? Because what's missing in publishing, when you break down the data, is not just writers and translation, right? It's stylistic diversity, right? It's linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity, religious diversity. Diversity, as we all know, at a top level in the corporate world, is spoken of as a flat and superficial thing. And diversity, as we all know, is very important when we think about it as a 360-degree, three-dimensional, living and breathing object that is alive and we need to work with and within. And something about publishing was that you're getting only writers of certain backgrounds into all these different categories and all these different genres. And so the first question I had, as a Slavic, all my degrees were Russian literature, right? But all the degrees actually said Russian and Eastern European literatures and languages, right? So here's a question. Do you think I'd ever been at a university that offered Ukrainian as a language? Right? Ukrainian, the second most widely spoken language of the Soviet Union, second most populous country in the former Soviet Union. No, of course not, right? And so I said, if I know about great Russian authors who are never being published in English, then it is guaranteed that there are great Ukrainian authors who are never being published in English. And if we're moving to Texas, I guarantee there's great Mexican authors who are never being published in English. And my hypothesis is that there are great writers in Dallas and across Texas who are also never being published, that are just being completely left out. And unfortunately, I was absolutely right. And so we have essentially a society that is producing culture from one place and it has become what we call a monoculture, right? All the books read the same way. Doesn't matter who wrote them, really. They're plot generated, might as well have been written by the AI bots that so many are terrified of. And I, dear reader, am not interested in that kind of writing. And I never have been, and I never will be. And so when we started to look around the world, the goal of Deep Vellum was to focus on what we call the business of literature, right? Publishing is a business. At the end of the day, how do publishers make money? This is call and response time. Sell books. All right. So Penguin Random House, right? It's the biggest publisher in the world for trade books. They make all their money from? Selling books. Okay. So let's say that you've written a book, a novel, work of poetry, a work of theater, done a translation, right? And Random House, you send it to Random House to get published, and they say no. What is the reason why they're not going to publish something great? Because it can't sell. Now, what is the threshold of sales for them? Yeah, I actually don't know. Massive must be the answer, right? Okay, so that's kind of fascinating. So what they're saying is that all literature and translation that we know about, all the great writers of Dallas and of Austin and elsewhere, don't have enough value in them to sell enough, and therefore you and me don't deserve to read them. You ever thought about it that way? Something is being withheld from us by forces that are ostensibly governed only for business reasons, right? If the only indicator of success for the corporate publishing world is in selling books, then by God, we have to create an alternative economy. We have to come up with a completely different value equation to approach publishing with, right? That puts the focus not on the business of selling books, but on the business of literature, on the words, the way they come together, what is unique about them. And so that we focus less on trying to sell 1 million copies of a book, because what's going to sell 1 million copies? The stuff that we have problems with, right? And do we have the resources as a startup publisher in Dallas to sell 1 million copies of a book? Of course not, right? It takes money to make money, as they say. But at the end of the day, what if you make the focus about making connections between readers and writers, make the connection between readers and readers, make the connection between you and me and the people outside who have opted out of literature? Can you build a more active and engaged readership? The problems are in what's getting published. At the same time, there's a problem in how few people in this country actually read books. 40% of the country last year read more than one book. That means that 60% did not. And so when we started a publishing house in Dallas, we started as a nonprofit to put this focus onto the community work and to say that we can't just publish a book and expect people to care, right? We're going to go to where people who do care about our kinds of books, we're going to come to you. I will come down to Austin and talk about books anytime. Invite me back. I love it. But at the same time, we got to go to the people who are opting out. You need to have a bookstore in Dallas as a way to invite people in off the street, random people, right? And every single day now, for 10 years, we get people walking off the street and say, I haven't read a book in 10 years, right? And you say, thank you for telling us that. It's not your fault. But now that you said it, boy, we got something for you. Come on over here to this wall, right? You got to invite someone into a conversation, right? And that conversation is literature writ large. So out of the 1,250 books Deep Vellum now has across all of our imprints, I guarantee any random person off the street, regardless of their academic background, regardless of their socioeconomic background, or any of those diversity standards we were just talking about, can walk in and engage with any book that we've published, right? At the same level as anyone with a PhD, anyone who grew up with a silver spoon, right? That stuff doesn't matter, but what does matter is curiosity. And curiosity is something that's totally lacking in how we treat literature as an art form, as a practice, as something that changes our lives today. And at the same time, we know scientifically that reading literature builds empathy in the reader. That is science. The science of empathy is tied to literary production. That is crazy, right? And the science of reading says that if you read something in a book, in a print book form, it's going to go to a part of your brain that is wired to the text on the page. And you read the same text on your screen, any screen, Kindle screen, phone screen, computer screen, it's going to go to the part of the brain that throws stuff away at the end of the day, right? Why? What is the science of reading? Why does this stuff matter so much? Why is it that Russian literature, we all know is this brand, Russian literature, TM, right? Old guys with beards talking about the big questions, right? We know that. But do we think that it stopped? Do we think that these are the only writers capable of doing that? Do we think that the literary canon as an academy is a fixed object, closed to discussion and entry? Some comparative literature students in here today, right? When I talked to Dr. Garza about my pending midlife crisis that I can see on the horizon, right? It is definitely to go get a PhD. Never had one in my whole family tree, right? Definitely want one. It's going to be great. Can't wait. But ostensibly, it's probably going to be saying comparative literature has a long way to go. How can we do that? What is it about this model on the business of literature, on this alternative economy that allows a tiny publisher in Dallas, Texas, right, to now have more languages and more countries and more books in translation than any other publisher in the history of the English language? That's not me bragging. That's me being embarrassed for the publishing industry, right, before us. How can that be, right? And what can we do about it to keep growing those numbers, right? So that when we said at the beginning, we can't just focus on the Russian literature that I know because my knowledge ends with me. It ends at the end of my nose, right? And I want to know more than the world outside of me. That's what started at the age of 14. That's what appealed to me about reading that book, The Life of a Useless Man, was about seeing a different way of putting a story together, a history of a country and a place I knew nothing about, and saying that I am not alone in this world, right? And I have a long way to go to learn about it. And literature for me, a kid from a small town in the South who had never left the South, can learn a lot through literature. I can meet the other, and I can see myself in the other, right? And the other stops being othered when you build these connections. This is something literature can do. And so when we started out to sign books, and we said we're going to sign our first authors, we're from Mexico, and from Ukraine, and from Indonesia, and from the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? Those were the first authors we signed. The author we signed from Ukraine was not Oksana first, but the amazing writer Sergei Zhadan from Kharkiv, who is a writer that checks every single box about everything I love about literature in the world, and who had only had one book come out in English before that, right? And it came out the same year we published ours, so roughly the same time. But how do we expand our knowledge of the world around us so that when we turn on the TV and we do see a conflict, we can say, this is not the other, this is me, right? So you can have a publishing house like Deep Vellum. Why are we the only publisher that has the authors from these different sides around the world? So that we could actually see the way that the world works. How can you build a business model that supports literature, though? This is what it boils down to, is in the business of literature, is that the business of literature is us, right? It's actually much more community-driven. We look at this from a nonprofit angle. We don't publish books only for their sales success because that is their indicator of success. And for all of us who love false binaries, it's a great teaching tool. I love a false binary. There is no us and them, but them, they do not think the same, right? One of my favorite singers said that once, right? And I love that line. But as we do that, this is an industry that is churning out the same stuff over and over and over again, and we have to be able to say that we're looking for the alternative, right? So that the business of literature is about the conversation that happens between the reader and the writer intimately, and it's about the conversation that happens on the cultural level between two entirely different cultures as they come together. And how can you foster that conversation to exist today, tomorrow, and in 10 years so these works can be elevated to find their readership and their discovery through time? So one last little anecdote, and then I want to do some Q&A. Do we have time for Q&A? Cool. All right. Is that we published a writer through our Dalkey archive imprint named Jan Fosse. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature last year, right? Jan Fosse is from Norway. He writes in a language called Nynorsk, which is like sort of old Norwegian. And it's the minority language of Norway. And his first 7 books in English came out from Dalkey Archive Press. And they, let's just say, were not bestsellers, right? For 15 years, they're available in English. And on the day he won the Nobel Prize, he sold more books in one day than he had sold his entire career before in English, right? So a door had opened into discovering this writer. Now, the crazy thing is that I just got some insider info from the Frankfurt Book Fair, which is the world's biggest trade show where the world of international literature comes together. And the insider info is that usually an author who wins the Nobel Prize, the big 5 usually come calling after that and take the author and do big work with them, right? And something interesting is that Dalkey Archive had a writer named Svetlana Alexievich, published a book called Voices from Chernobyl in 2006. Came out in English. It's Dalkey Archive's best-selling single title. And it's an extraordinary book. And when she won the Nobel Prize, Penguin Random House came calling. They said, could we republish that for you? And Dalkey said yes. And so there was a 7-year contract signed. And Penguin Random House published that book in English for 7 years. And then you know what they did? They gave it back. So we published it again, right? OK. And what's crazy is Jan Fosse, the big 5 went calling. And they're like, yeah, could we publish this guy's next books? And then they couldn't get it approved by the corporate bosses, which means that the Nobel Prize no longer guarantees commercial success enough to be able to go out there. Now, when you look at Jan Fosse and you look at the business of literature in different markets around the world, Norway is a very interesting case study because it is, of course, an oil-rich country that has one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the entire world. And they invest their oil money in their people. And one of the things that you can do there is apply for essentially a stipend to be an artist, and you can just do art for the rest of your life and never have to worry about selling things. And so my man Jan Fosse lives by the fjords in western Norway, and he writes books in which not much happens, right? By plot standards of American literature. A man goes for a walk, goes into the woods, has a spiritual awakening, end of story, right? It's beautiful. He writes plays, there's some dialogue, a little bit of dialogue, a spiritual awakening, in scene, right? It's extraordinary literature, but does it fit the standards of what American publishers think we deserve? No. He's a perfect example. His only 2 publishers in America are a nonprofit press based in Dallas, Texas, and a nonprofit press based in Oakland, California. That's trying to tell us a lot about what the future of literature as a genre, as quality, as a standard of storytelling, right? And so when we look at the business side of it, there is something that we have to fight against and within. And when we talk about the way that they pick the books, they're not just picking the books and spending the most money on that. They're also controlling the marketing and the distribution, the printing, so that every single aspect of the logistical chain is controlled by 5 companies who control not just 90% of the books you read, but 90% of the ways that you discover books, right? And so when you go to those bookstores that have the 5 books recommended by booksellers, you have to ask yourself, those questions of the humanities that impacted me so long, I wanted to find a way to impact society, I beg of you to take that same critical eye to the bookshelves and to the publishers and question, why is this here? And if this is here, what is missing? And that will get us toward that alternative economy of literature, and that is sort of what we're all about. Thank you again for this invitation. I would love any questions, because guaranteed I did not touch on every single interesting thing about the business of literature. Anybody have a good one?
Can we first thank you?
Oh, no, come on, man.
So much for that. Lots of things, but I know we've got a lot of questions out there for you.
Please don't be shy.
I have a really non-important question, but I'm just sort of curious.
Okay.
I hate how generic book covers are.
Yep.
I feel like when you walk into a bookstore, they all look like kind of AI generated or
Totally. Thank you.
sort of like which can be cool, but the way that it's done, I think, feels so generic. So I was just curious if you would like to, on a petty level, talk smack with us about your feelings, if you have any, about
Great.
the book covers, or how you choose, how you guys are working with different artists, what that looks like.
Totally. What a great question. Should I repeat the questions for the video? Is that better? So the question was about book cover design, essentially how homogenous they are, and would I like to talk smack? Yes. And then to talk about the book cover design process. For us, yeah, I think it's great. I think that the publishing business is an extremely conservative business. I don't mean just politically, I mean kind of it's reactionary, right? And what sells to them is what sold yesterday. They're not looking to lead for what sells tomorrow. And when you think about what attracts someone to pick up an object, right? That has changed a lot because, for example, our publishing house, out of all the sales that we do in the world through bookstores, not ours, not on our website, 20% of our book sales are through independent bookstores. And that's very high for a small publisher like us. Usually publishers through our distributor get about 6 to 7% at the most. That would be the peak for someone else. But that does mean that 80% of our book sales are happening not at independent bookstores. And that means that when you break those numbers down, about half of our sales are happening on Amazon. And so when you look at how you discover a book now, you need something that catches your eye in thumbnail form as much as it does on a front table, which would have been your means of discovery once upon a time. The brighter colors, the vector graphics you mentioned, the flatness, the way that things pop off the page is now less tactile like it used to be, and more it grabs your eye in a certain way when you see it digitally out across the universe, right? Because you're going to see that for the big publishers with big marketing budgets, you're going to see that on an Amazon page, but also recommended on this literary site, this magazine, this blog, this Twitter, this Instagram. And you want something that is visually appealing to as many people as possible. People love bright colors. They love flowers, as we've learned over the last couple of years. And that's all well and good. It is no different, though, than in the old days when most covers looked the same, too. It's just that also something to remember is that publishing is all about time. And the big publishers publish in a very short window of time. Success for them is very temporal. Like, they want to make their money back within the year, probably within a couple of months, right? That's why they gave Voices from Chernobyl back to us, right? It's not making enough money. Boy, let me tell you, it's keeping the lights on, right, at Deep Vellum. And so this is important for us, but they're also trying to say that 175 years ago, 100 years ago, what were the best-selling books of those years? Are they the books that we're studying in this university? These books are going to be gone, right? And a lot of what we're seeing is fluff. And so the book covers of this era are fascinating because if they're going to go one way with their book cover design, small publishers and independent publishers are usually going to go a different way, right? And so the best example of that, I would say in the modern sort of times, is there's a publisher in the UK called Fitzcarraldo Editions who we share a lot of authors. We share Fossa, Alexievich, and others. And their book design is that they publish fiction and nonfiction, and the fiction books are all blue with a serif font called Fitzcarraldo, a bespoke font that they got, and it says the name of the book and the author, and it has the publisher's name on it. And then they have nonfiction books that are white, and in blue it says the name of the author, the name of the book, and the publishing house. And that's it. So they look exactly the same. All the books are the same. It's anti in this way. And so there's a completely different value equation put on that. But it does mean that if you are an average reader, what is going to tempt you to this book, right? There's nothing about the cover that's going to draw you to the text, but it is saying that when you're in, you're in. Every book there is on a tier. I get that, and I love that. I think it's really fascinating. There have been American publishers who've done that for years, including Wave Books, who do a lot of poetry. It's extraordinary. Text-based covers is a great way of doing the antithesis of that. At Deep Vellum in the early days, we worked with a designer named Anna Zellick, who was one of my dear friends I grew up with. She studied book design at North Carolina State. And we wanted our designs to be geometric and eye-catching, but also kind of flat and two-dimensional, right, as opposed to all the flowers and the bright colors you were seeing. And so we started out with that kind of book design, and as we were growing as a company, we got away from that. We started working with more designers. And when we work with all these different kinds of designers now, none of our books look the same, right? Even if we use the same designer on 5 books a year, we send them kind of a list of what the author wants. We send them usually the foreign editions of the books, if there are any. But we now send like questionnaires to authors and say, what is the most important visual element you would like to see on the book cover, right? It's not necessarily what we're going to do, because maybe they want to put one metaphor from the book on the cover, and we're like, I don't want to put it there. But we work with them in a dialogue and go back and forth and try and find it. So for example, the cover of Ivan and Phoebe with Oksana was really...
Yeah, I
I
wish I brought my book to show it.
Yeah.
It's an amazing cover. It's like embroidery, basically.
Yeah, it's like a Ukrainian embroidery, but it was like created for this book cover, right? And it's unique because it looks different. It doesn't look like other books that are out there. It has this distinctive quality. There's something Ukrainian about this. It ties into the book, but you don't know what. You have to kind of read it to find out. And so that kind of works. Like we want to bring the texts, we want to bring the readers to what's original about these books. We don't want to pander to them by making the books look like everything else that's out there. And I think the book design, some of the designers we've worked with have just done extraordinary work, and our marketing team work really intently on that. It's a big part of how we share our story with the world. And so I think book design is endlessly fascinating. And so if any of y'all are designers, hit us up. We're always looking for new friends and new ways to tell that kind of story. It's really fun. And you could write a whole dissertation on book cover design and what horrors it's done to different cultures around the world. Because we published this writer from Democratic Republic of Congo named Fiston Mwanza Mujila. He's shortlisted for the National Book Award. We find out next week if he wins, fingers crossed. But most books from Africa, regardless of where the author is from on the continent, they get a baobab tree, right, on the cover. And if you're a writer from Asia, you get the treatment of some kind of Chinese lantern or some others. You get these stereotypes over and over and over again. And from Russia, you get, St. Basil's Cathedral, and you get, or a silhouette of Putin, for Christ's sake. And it's just like, to be able to not pander and like speak down to readers, but to bring them up and to bring them towards these texts and these often cultures they're meeting for the first time. That's serious work, and I just don't think that many people worked in publishing before that serious of people. So that's the smack I'll talk. Yeah. Yes.
I had a question about what you were talking about. You mentioned cinema and how there's a similar process going on of 5 big studios.
Mm-hmm.
How I wondered if you ever get asked about, since you're working specifically with printed media, right? Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned like empathy, and how do you encourage people? I mean, it's one thing to encourage someone to watch a film that was made by an independent studio, but it's different to encourage someone to read like a huge novel from an independent publisher. So when you're doing that, what do you tell people about the importance of engaging with written media opposed to moving images?
That's $1 million question. I like it. What do we do about the conversation of how the written word and the moving image and the storytelling forms the relationship between them, right? How to describe a little bit about that. I think it's fascinating. So we deal with printed matter. We deal with the written word. And the written word these days includes ebooks, and it includes audiobooks often. And so that's kind of interesting because those are 2 very different forms of storytelling, as I just mentioned. Same words, but presented to the reader in very different ways. There is something about the written word that defines humanity as opposed to whatever we were pre the species we are today, right? It is what separates us from our ancestors. It is what makes us human. It's this universal gift for storytelling. And the spoken word came first, and the written word took us to another level as a species. And there's something to the fact that no matter what language of the world, no matter what script, no matter what material, that when you write it down, what it has done to the brain, the mapping of language between the hand and the page and the brain as you read it, has changed us forever and expanded our brain's capacity. And I think that the moving image, I love movies. I lived in Austin during the era before Alamo Drafthouse became the national chain it is now, right? So the fun fact is, you guys know this, that like all the best things about Austin from my era here are also now in Dallas, but you guys got all the worst parts about Dallas from back then too, which is really fun. So haha. But that, I loved it, and the guy who started the Alamo Drafthouse is a good friend, a guy named Tim League, and we love to talk about this all the time too. Why is it that movie studios turn to books for inspiration? What is it about books that have storytelling that takes things to another level? Why is it that when we think of international cinema as well, you find that the best screenwriters are often novelists, over and over and over again, whether in Mexico, you think about Juan Rulfo, whether in Korea with all the amazing writers who've been writing scripts there. And I think that really kind of what it boils down to is that there's something about the way that you can tell the story through time. And again, a book is like something, you're stepping outside of time when you're in there. And it can be a labor of love to convince someone to read a 700-page Romanian surrealist book. It's easier to tell them to read or watch a 90 or 100-minute Romanian film, right? But it doesn't make it easier, right? And it doesn't mean that all the same things are able to be brought to the fore. And so for the written word, what we're kind of looking for is that stylistic dance of language, the same way that when I look at cinema, I'm looking for the poetry of the visual, right? And the way that those two things interpose is interesting because I want my books to not describe everything the way that you see them in a movie scene. And I think that movie directors agree, right? How many books have you guys read, especially American authors? They love doing this. They'll over-describe a scene down to like the color of the flowers in the vase and the way everything in the room looks exactly. It's like over-description, and it means nothing, but they can see the cinema image in their mind, and they're writing for film, right? But movie directors they don't want you to tell them everything because they want the universal in the story that they can bring the visual to in that way. The dance of words and image is what makes cinema the art form as opposed to movies, right? And kind of reminds me of back in the day when we think about movies. We don't think about what this word actually means in English anymore, but it was as opposed to talkies, you know, and how ridiculous language is. And so movies is the beautiful moving image. And when we put the written word together with that and this dance of dialogue and the visual, it becomes literature as well, right? And so I look at it from that angle as opposed to being like, you know, bad book, bad movie, it's all good, you know? So, yeah.
You started off your speech like by thanking Dr. Garza. I also want to thank Dr. Garza because, yeah, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to do that. I've been running this virtual translation group called Turkish Literature and Translation for the last 4 years, generously sponsored by Texas Language Center. We couldn't do that without them. So actually Amy came to our group a couple of years ago to talk about a book that you published called Strange Woman. It's such an underrated book in Turkish lit too, and I highly recommend that you all like read the book and buy it, purchase it actually.
Buy 10, share them with your friends.
Yeah, and before I came to this meeting, I checked out its cover again, dust jacket, and I don't know if you know, but like recently, NYRB published
Ozatay.
Turkish novel in translation again, like by Ozatay, Waiting for the Fears, and then what I noticed, what's really interesting in that like dust jacket is that you don't get to see the name of the translator, but you get to see the name of Merve Emre, who is a person that like stands at the forefront of like publication industry in both in America and in Turkey. She's also a teacher at Yale, maybe, right?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, Yale or Duke. Yeah. So paratextually speaking, what I notice is that like, again, as part of this publication industry, like I feel like there's some like tactics and like strategies that like publication houses like follow or like need to follow, such as like putting Merve Emre up there rather than like the person who did the job itself. And I don't know how the translator feels about that. I don't know if you notice it, but like how do you feel about those kinds of like dynamics and like have you had any experiences? Obviously you have experiences, but would you like to share anything?
Yeah.
About, like, how that works.
For those listening at home, and because this is recorded, my answer is different, but off screen, I have another answer for you too. It's about translators' acknowledgments on the cover, paratextually how covers come together, and a recommendation that everyone should buy a copy of A Strange Woman by Leyla Erbil. It's an extraordinary novel. And the translator's name was Nermin Menamanjul? Yeah, Menamanjul. Everyone check that out. Great book. Deep Vellum published it, so it's a bit. Thank you. So when it comes to translators' names on the cover has been, for the past 15 years or so, it's been a big debate topic as well within that tiny corner of the literary world that cares about translations, because the translator is a writer, and they are obviously rewriting this work into a language for this audience, and English is such a, it's the lingua franca of the moment, so we have a duty to share these stories with the world for discovery in many different ways. But the way that information on book covers does come together is very intentional, and there is a line of thought in traditional publishing, and not just traditional, but even at independent publishers that I absolutely love, like NYRB or like Fitzcarraldo Editions in the UK, that say that the translator's name does not go on the cover under any circumstance. They make it, that's their policy. So they've held to it, even when the translators are famous, even when the author is extremely famous. But what does go on the cover is the author's name, and if there is an introduction, who introduced it. And so that is interesting, and there are a lot of things you could say about that. If the author, we put the translator's name on every cover at Deep Vellum. It's very important to us. There are people who say it changes the way the book design looks, and they don't like it with the translator's name on the cover. And I was like, well, get your designers to be designier. But then there's also this practice that has come in, and whether NYRB and Fitzcarraldo know it or not, it is part of a tradition in America and England that there are no groups of people more scared of the other in the world than Americans and British readers, and they're terrified of foreignness, and they avoid it at all costs. This is the way people talk about it, that they will read a book by a Turkish American, no problem, but they don't want to know it's translated. Right? And so that they'll hide and bury the information on the translation as much as you can to try to invite someone into the story. And then it offers the door opening into a debate, which is, should translations try to be read only as the books they are as compared to other books in the market, or also as something that is foreign, that brings something new, that the Turkishness of this book is something worth celebrating too. So when you walk into a bookstore, should a bookstore have a translation section or not? Right? People can get pretty passionate about this debate. I believe they should, but that in a dream world, like if it's a novel by Uzatai or Layla Erbil, that they're in the translation section and the fiction section. But really what we're looking for is anything that can make a book stand out in the world, because I never answered the question, how many books are published in America every year, right? It's somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million, right? Depending on what you think a book is in this day and age. And yeah, so 500,000 print books, maybe. Okay, that sounds about right. But then now you can print anything on Amazon, right? It's just amazing. So anyhow, all that to say, but out of 500,000 books coming out every year, how on earth can you get your book read? Anything that can get it to rise above the chatter of nonsense in this society and the visual distractions of the sameness of the book we're being presented with. Having a translation section, I think, is, of course, something that could draw eyes to something they didn't know was there before. Rather than othering, it might be a way of saying that this is a distinctiveness, right? Not foreignizing, but saying, here is something you didn't know was possible. Because if you also have just the fiction section and literature and translation is there among the other books, then the smaller publishers just get buried on the wall of spines out. And if a book is spine out in the bookstore, it's never going to sell. If it's face out, it sells 100% higher, right? So the science behind discovery, discoverability is the thing in publishing these days, one of those buzzwords. It sounds like it was invented in the business school. And so the question is, especially in this day and age where 80% of sales at least are happening online, why not put the translator's name on the cover? You're not going to be able to squint and see it anyways. So, and by God, they've worked their butts off at it, and they deserve it, right? Nina Murray's name is on that cover because she did a heck of a job bringing Oksana's Ukrainian into English so that I can read it, right? And so thank you, Nina. Nina, thank you. But also thank you, Oksana. And so this is a great way to lift these authors up. And something that is really fun, too, is now there are publishers who play with this stuff all the time. We didn't do it in Oksana's book, but we could have. Sometimes it's fun to make the translator's name just as big as the author's name. It really makes people feel weird. And we like that. So anything, if we're on the smaller side, like we can take risks sometimes that the bigger publishers are not willing to. And honestly, we should. And so NYRB is a great example because they're like the most perfect publishing model imaginable. I admire everything they've done. The books they choose are extraordinary. But Ralph Hubble, who translated this Thai book, he deserves his name on the cover for the work that he did. I have a great story for you about Thai after this too, if you'd like. It's really great. Yeah.
So a lot of the talk, thank you so much, this was great.
Thank you. It's an honor.
It's nice to have like a lesson balance.
Last question?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Oh, it's kind of, last one, yes.
Perfect.
I'll be quick. Talked about the dire situation for reading in general, number of books, and for those of us who work on poetry, it can feel even more dire to bring out our translations of poetry, because it feels like even if you can find a publisher, they're scared and they don't, because they know they're not going to find readers. So what's been the experience at Deep Vellum with poetry in particular?
Oh,
In translation and not?
poetry. Poetry, the written form that goes back closest to the original oral tradition. I went to a poetry reading in Dallas last week, a project done by our Dallas poet laureate named Mag Gabbert. And she was working with a group called the Thanksgiving Foundation, which has this beautiful chapel in downtown Dallas. And it was about these virtues. And so she selected poets, and they all write a poem on a different virtue. And so all the poets got up and read. And so there were like 30 poets who read, and 29 of them read in free verse, unmetered, unrhymed, just free verse. And then there was one guy who read in rhyme. And so it's kind of interesting. We talk about diversity in literature, right? You know, poetry is an infinite array of possibilities. And the way that poetry has been removed from the living and breathing fabric of society has seemed intentional by the other, right? Like they don't like poetry. They think it's bad for us. But at the same time, like this over-academicization, is that a word, of poetry is, yeah, it's something we kind of all have to grapple with, because we at Deep Vellum all are obsessed with poetry, and we see it as part of our daily ritual, right, of life, like reading poetry. And we publish poetry, and it's a terrible business decision to do. It is awful. You do it for the love of the game, period. And so from the nonprofit sense, the goal is that we need to find money somewhere to offset the costs of bringing out this thing, right? We have not done it yet. We haven't stopped publishing poetry, but by God, we should. It's like we could all have bigger Christmas bonuses if we'd stop paying poets. And again, the poets aren't the problem. It's their books are expensive and warehousing, but all that to say, poetry is an anti-corporate kind of entity, right? And so it fits into the small press and publishing world really well, and it always has. It's always been about the alternative economy. Kind of what I was just describing today would not seem radical at all to the beat poets of the 60s who were like, yeah, they don't care about us at all. We're just going to go do our own thing, right? It comes naturally to excluded groups. I'm a white guy trying to bring the world into conversation through literature, but let me tell you, there are Black and Latino and indigenous publishers all across the country who are like, we've been doing this forever because no one would ever take our call. This alternative economy, we want to include all these groups, but at the same time, there has been a strong history in American publishing of other groups being completely excluded and creating cultures of value around writing and publishing. Poetry is one, right? And I think that that's something really important to say. I am only one small part of a much greater whole. I stand on the shoulders of giants who came before me. And that, when you look at poetry, the thing about it is, if you are even thinking about sales of it, you're coming at it the wrong way. Have fun. The thing about poetry is there's no money in it, which means that there are the most poetry publishers of any genre of publisher. There is someone willing to publish what you're doing. I guarantee it, right? It might be this freak. It might be the freak next door. It might be some freak online. But we're all freaks obsessed with poetry. And it is so important to us. And so when we publish poetry, especially in translation, what language do you translate from? Arabic. Oh, it's awesome. We usually do dual texts, like, so you have Arabic on one side and English on the other, which is something growing up I hated. And I hated it because I was taught that translation was an impossible act, and I had professors and teachers who told me I should never read translations. I should only read the original. And so they would say, look at that original. You should look how bad the translation is. And I hated that. But now I love looking at this language and saying, look at the poetry I don't know. And now look at what I do know, right? Because that's fine when I can read a Russian poem, I can read a Spanish poem and see something beautiful about it in the original, but I can't look at an Arabic poem and hear the music. I can't read a Chinese poem. I can't read a French poem. I can't read an Italian, let alone all the other languages of the world. And so Deep Vellum's project is to like confront those ignorances and try to like bring that dialogue together. And it's really cool when we get to do it for languages that have been oppressed or suppressed for too long, whether it's Zapotec or Uyghur or Lingala, and so you can bring the original up to the level of the literary languages that they are. It's really beautiful. So again, don't worry about the sales. Have fun with the magic of it, you know, and the sales will come right later. So Thank you so much, Dr. Garza, for everything. Thank you all.